Hello everybody, I'm back today with another long overdue Marvel Legends review, and this week I'm going to be taking a look at another Amazon exclusive set, the West Coast Avengers 5-figure set. Now, the West Coast Avengers tends to be seen as the poor relation to the main Avengers title. That being said though, growing up reading these comics, I have a soft spot for these characters and this title. And whilst, yeah, in terms of quality it's probably not as sharp as the main Avengers title, I still think this is actually quite a fun run and actually has some really interesting moments. So for me personally, as soon as this set was announced, I was both surprised but also really quite excited because I wanted to build a full-fledged roster of West Coast Avengers. Now, like the main Avengers, of course, that roster has changed throughout the years, and each of the characters had different costumes. And the set we have here is interesting because the mix of characters that we see in these specific costumes, I don't think ever actually work together at any one time, and of course it is missing the vital component, the leader that is Hawkeye. So quite an unusual set, but really fun and interesting, but probably one from the get-go that's going to be aimed towards those die-hard Marvel Legends collectors. So as ever, let's start off by talking about the packaging. Now the packaging is about 15 inches tall, it's also pretty broad, so we have a pretty large canvas here for this central image, which I have to say is absolutely fantastic. I love how bright and colourful this is, I love this newly commissioned artwork. It's clearly taking a nostalgic nod back to the actual comic books themselves. You can clearly see that they've taken their inspiration from West Coast Avengers issue #1, and I have to say, I think they've done a fantastic job of mirroring the tone and style of the artwork from those comic books. So I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job here replicating that, changing some of the key figures of course to make it appropriate for this action figure set, but this looks absolutely brilliant. I think they've done a really great job, and this is just instantly really displayable in its own right. This looks great on the shelf. And if we flip it over and look at the side panel, at the top of the packaging we can see the Avengers 60th anniversary logo, which is pretty cool, and then we have each of the character profiles taken from this artwork on the front of the packaging. However, if we flip it over, we have the same thing again, but this time it's actually the headshots of each of the figures themselves. So you have the choice here of displaying whichever one fits more in line with your personal preference if you want to stack these on your shelf on their side profile. And then finally, if we look at the back of the packaging, we have this sort of full page spread here. Each character is given its own alcove, so to speak, with a blue collage of various characters in the background of the Avengers celebrating that 60th anniversary. We saw this on a lot of the 60th anniversary action figures that were released last year through the Marvel Legends line, and each one is a digital rendering of the figure, but also the various bits and pieces that they come along with as well. Overall, I think this is very attractive as well, and I think they've done a really nice job with this packaging. You will notice that it is largely text-free, which is brilliant, so this makes it a really visual, very standout kind of packaging, which looks great on display. There is a top folding flap at the top of the packaging, so of course you can slide out the interior card packaging which is holding all the figures in place. It is all pretty much one piece, and when we flip it around you can see the figures there contained snugly in their rice paper holdings. Now, as you know, I'm not a huge fan of this approach just because I'd rather have a figure nicely secured into its place with plastic. It just makes it easier to store these figures when they're not out on display, but this works pretty well. Okay, so first up we actually have one of the later additions to the West Coast Avengers roster, which is of course the Julia Carpenter Spider-Woman. Now, I've always really liked this costume and this character. Of course, this isn't the first Spider-Woman we've ever had, because we did get one a few years ago for the Multi-Man Build-A-Figure wave, which in and of itself was a huge improvement and a massive update on the Toy Biz version of the character we had a few years earlier. Now, in terms of the Multi-Man version, you could be forgiven at first glance for thinking this is the same figure, just simply reissued, but that is not the case, because there are some new pieces which we'll see in the arms a little bit later, looking at the articulation, but also you'll notice that this is a new head sculpt as well, and I have to say, I think this is a superior head sculpt that we're getting this time around. I think this looks really good. I really like the flow of the hair, the dimensions of the eyes and the mask to the mouth, particularly the lips as well. I think this is very well done, and of course we're seeing some nice paint apps here as well, so we're seeing the red on the lips, and there's a little bit of a wash running through the hair. Not as much as I would like to see, to be honest, but there is a little bit, there is a hint there, giving it a little bit more depth and texture than we are used to seeing currently from Marvel Legends. So I think at least they're making the effort here. It could be improved, but I think this is actually pretty good. Now, when it comes to the main body sculpt, you will see that obviously they've just recycled the female body sculpt that we're used to seeing on a lot of the female characters from Marvel Legends in current year. So I think, there haven't been a tremendous amount of effort put into this. It's a shame that the top of the gloves and the spider emblem isn't actually sculpted in. It is just painted on. I think it does the job. I don't have any real complaints with this. It would have been nice if there'd been more of a wash, some highlights going on in terms of the paints. As it is, it's just the bare plastic that it's molded in with the white paint painted over for the spider effects and the gloves, which is a little bit disappointing. But we do have these brand new arms, which I think is really good. I really like the double joints that we see in the elbows here. This is fantastic. We're so used to seeing the single pin swivel on the female character, so it's great that we're seeing the double pins here. This is brilliant. There's not much else to say when it comes to the legs or the feet. Again, we have seen these many times over. This has just been recycled, and yeah, they're perfectly functional, but there's nothing new to talk about here. In terms of articulation, she does have a ball joint at the top of her neck. Now, this is restricted a little bit by that very inflexible headpiece, or hairpiece, which is very unfortunate. So she can move her head from side to side, and she can bend it forward a decent amount. She can't really bend it backwards at all, though, unfortunately. Now, she does have ball joints in the shoulders, so of course she can lift her arms all the way up and out, which is great. There's a complementary bicep swivel there, and she has a double joint at the elbow, which is fantastic, so she can get her hand all the way back to her head, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, she does have a pin swivel at the wrist, so she can rotate the hand all the way around, and of course she can hinge it forwards and backwards as well. In the upper torso, she does have a ball joint here as well, so she can move from side to side, she can lean left and right a pretty good distance, and she is able to bend forwards and backwards as well. She's got ball joints in the hips, of course she can kick her legs out to the side, there's an upper thigh swivel there, the legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and there's a double joint at the knee so she can get that lower leg all the way back there. Then finally she does have the ankle pivots, of course that foot will hinge forwards and backwards, but it'll also rock from side to side. Accessories, I'm afraid, is very disappointing. The only thing she comes with is an additional pair of closed fists. And that's it. No spider effects, no alternate head, nothing. All in all, I have to say I do really like this figure. I'm only going to give it 3 stars though, because there's nothing here that really surprises me or really pushes the boat out. Now, I have to be upfront and say I do think this is a massive improvement over the previous Molten Man Bath release. Definitely having those extra articulation in the elbows is really good, and I do way prefer this head sculpt as well. So I do think it's a significant improvement over that release and probably does justify the double dip if you're on the fence about it. But there's nothing else really particularly revolutionary about this figure. The rest of the body, of course, we've seen many times before. The detail is just painted on, and of course there is some restriction to the articulation, particularly in the head there with that hairpiece, and I'm really disappointed about the minimalization when it comes to the accessories. I think it would be really cool to have an unmasked alternate head, or some spider web effects or something. It's really strange that we just get the alternate pair of hands. Next up we have Hank Pym, and interestingly, whilst this costume is probably the most boring of all the superhero costumes in the West Coast Avengers comic book, here in this action figure set he's probably the standout figure for being the most unique and interesting. And I think that's largely due to the fact that there's a lot of new pieces here. So this looks like a brand new head sculpt. I don't think we've seen this on any other figure before. I think this works really quite well. I've got to be honest, I think this is a pretty decent likeness of the character. I really like what they've done with the hair there. There is actually a wash running through it, giving it that depth, that texture that I always talk about. So I think that looks really good. I think they've got the actual paint apps on the face right, and there's a lot of detail here that makes this look authentic and real, which I think is really good. And then if we look at the body sculpt, this looks to be pretty new to me. Now, we may have seen these arms and the legs, possibly the boots, used before, although I can't actually put my finger on it where we may have seen these. So these actually might be new pieces as well. Certainly this torso though, this has to be new. I don't believe I've ever seen this on any other Marvel Legends figure. So please let me know in the comments if you think I'm mistaken on that, but I think this is the first time we're seeing this, and that makes this tremendously exciting. Now, interestingly, in terms of the overall size, he looks probably a little too big, to be honest, especially if we put him next to Iron Man, where he just looks really quite beefy here, even though he's just in overalls. Now, Now, sadly, although I really like the sculpt, the paint apps really aren't great. There's really no washes running through this to emphasise any of the detailing that we see in the ruffles in the costume, which is a real shame. And if you look closely even at this belt, you can see that there's actually the one bit of silver paint that's been added to the buckle actually bled into the rest of the belt, which is really, really lazy, and just really disappointing to see that, really. But otherwise, I think this is a pretty good looking figure. As I said, it's probably the most interesting one because it has such a very different look to any other figure in the Marvel Legends line, and it feels quite new. In terms of articulation, there's no real surprises here. There is a ball joint at the top of the neck, allowing the head to spin all the way around. It will lean left and right a good distance too, and of course it will nod forwards and backwards a pretty healthy distance there as well. There's ball joints in the shoulders, so the arms will lift up and out, and there is a complementary bicep swivel there as well, and of course a double joint at the elbow. Finally, there's a pin swivel here at the end of the wrist, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. There's a swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to move from side to side, and there's a very noticeable ab crunch in the centre of the torso there, allowing the figure to kind of bend forwards a little bit. Mostly he can bend backwards. Now there's ball joints in the hips, allowing the legs to kick up to the side. There's the thigh swivel at the top of the thigh there. The legs will kick forwards and they'll go back well enough. And then there's a double joint at the knee there, so that lower leg can come all the way back. Finally, we do have this extra swivel at the top of the boot, which is great. And then we have the ankle pivot as well, allowing that foot to hinge forwards and backwards and rock from side to side. Accessories wise, just like Spider-Woman, all he comes with is an extra pair of gripping hands. This is really disappointing again. I mean, if ever there was a character that needed to come to have some accessories with him, whether it's just some bit of technology, some invention, anything really, this is the one that desperately needs it, because he needs that to really define himself as the character, just to give him something a little bit more visually interesting to him, because his costume is quite lacking in that area. So this is really, really quite lazy and very disappointing to see. So for me, once again, this is another 3-star effort, I'm afraid. I think this is a really nice figure. I'm really pleased to see the new body sculpt and the various bits and pieces here. I really like this head sculpt as well. I think this is really successful. But other than that, this figure feels like it's lacking something. It's really definitely lacking in accessories to really bring this character and this figure to life. But also, you know, a healthy paint wash would have been really appreciated here, just to bring out some shading, a little bit of more depth and texture to the actual costume itself. As it is, it just feels very flat, and it's such a shame because they're so close to doing something really interesting and different here. Next up, we have the Silver Centurion Iron Man, and I think the thing that's going to be immediately obvious about this figure is that he's white rather than silver. Now, in terms of release, this is pretty much a straight-up re-release of the Silver Centurion Iron Man from Hasbro from just a couple of years ago. Now, funnily enough, I actually passed on that figure first time around because I wasn't super impressed with it in terms of its overall look. Now, you may recall that Toy Biz did a version of the Silver Centurion Iron Man a few years earlier, and I happen to still have great affection for that figure, although by today's standards it does look disproportionately clunky and a little bit strange, but I actually still really like that figure, and I think that's probably still superior to the Hasbro release that came a few years later. That being said, I do really like this sculpt now, and I think the paint apps really help this particular version of the figure. And one of the things I think is very clever about this particular version, or this particular release, is the choice of the white over the silver paint, because as you'll know from the comic books, it's kind of open to artistic license. Very often silver would be represented by white in comic books, so I think this is kind of a clever way that Hasbro are able to offer us something new whilst not really having to put much work or effort into it. But that said, I think this is really quite effective. This is a lot more appealing to me than the silver painted version. For some reason, that just felt off somehow, and this just looks a lot closer to the spirit of the comic book version. And for what it's worth, I think the sculpting is actually pretty decent. It all seems to be in proportion, and it looks pretty accurate really, so I can't really fault it for that. Where I would fault it, I suppose, is on the, once again, the lack of paint apps that we're seeing on these figures. There's no washes, there's no highlights, there's nothing here to really draw the eye, which is a real shame. They're just kind of sculpted and moulded in these base plastic moulds, and we're not really drawing out the detail that is there, and it's disappointing to see this again and again. There's nothing really new to comment on when it comes to the articulation scheme, so I'm not going to cover that here now, but I will talk about the accessory, because he does fare a little bit better than the previous figures in this video so far. He comes with an alternate pair of closed fists and 2 repulsor blast effects. Now, This isn't particularly exciting because we get this with pretty much every Iron Man figure we get these days from Hasbro's Marvel Legends line, and there are a lot of Iron Man figures, so this doesn't feel particularly exciting anymore, and it's a shame because the original release of the Silver Centurion Iron Man actually came with some new effects, which would have been nice if they'd replicated here, but they didn't, so this is all we get. That being said though, I'm happy to give this figure 4 stars because I'm actually really tremendously pleased with it, and I didn't think I would be because I passed on the original release. I actually think the updated colour scheme works really well and really brings this version of the character to life, so I'm actually really happy with this. I think the articulation is really solid, and of course those blast effects just give it a little bit more visual interest. So all in all, I think this is actually a really good addition. It's probably one of the standout characters when you put him on display, even though it is just a bare bones re-release of what we've seen previously. I do like that they've updated that white paint. That makes a huge difference. Next up we have Mockingbird, and for me personally this is the main reason to buy this set because we've never had a classic costume Mockingbird in the Marvel Legends line. Unbelievably, we've only ever had one other Mockingbird, and that is the more modern costume that we see in the comic books. So really pleasing to finally have this character, and I really like this character because she was really important in the West Coast Avengers, being obviously Hawkeye's wife and being part of quite a shocking storyline as a child anyway. It went to quite an unusual place, at least in that initial run, which was pretty cool and always lodged the character in my mind. So I'm really pleased to finally have one. I have to say, I think they've done a tremendous job with the figure. I think they've really caught the likeness and the costume really well. I really like the sculpting, particularly if we look at the head sculpt here. It's nice to see actually that paint wash running through the hair again. It's quite subtle, but it is there. It just gives it a little bit more depth and texture, which looks really good. The one criticism I would have is that they kind of got it in this windswept effect, so that's kind of blowing in the wind, which isn't always going to be appropriate for the pose that I want to put it in. So in a way I wish this was just kind of straight and resting on the shoulders, but it does make it look a little bit more visually dynamic, I suppose, so I'm happy to overlook it. I think they've done a good job with the mask as well, and I think overall this looks really good. In terms of the main body sculpt, there's not too much to write home about here. Of course, we've seen this piece before. They have just recycled this. Again, the detailing is just painted in as opposed to sculpted in. But if we look at the arms, you will notice that the sleeves are actually sculpted in. This, I think, is new. I don't believe we've seen this type of arm before. And she does actually have bracelets as well, which are nicely sculpted in. And I don't believe that we've seen this piece recycled from any other figures. Now, I might be wrong on that, but this looks new to me. And if we look at the boots, again we can see that they're quite stylized. I feel like we may have seen these before, to be fair, but they work really well here, and it's nice to see the heel, and pleasingly she can stand freely. There's no issues of her wobbling or falling over, which can sometimes happen with this small surface area on the foot, especially when there's a heel involved. This works really well and I think looks really good. I'm only going to cover a couple of brief points on the articulation, and one is the head, because I wanted to show what happens with this hairpiece. She can turn her head from side to side without much difficulty, thankfully. Now when it comes to moving up and down, she can move it down a really great distance, which is great, but of course it is limited when it comes to bending it backwards. The other point I wanted to pick up on is the fact that she only has the single pin swivel at the elbow, so that will rotate all the way around and it will hinge to about 90 degrees, but she doesn't benefit from the double jointed elbow that we saw with Spider-Woman. Accessories wise, she probably fares the best out of all the figures in this set. She comes with an alternate pair of hands, which is great, but she also has these sort of nunchucks which can actually fit together. I believe we've probably seen this on Daredevil figures in the past. And then she has this giant bow staff as well, which again, probably recycled from Gambit, I suspect, but nevertheless a pretty cool array of different weapons here and different accessories that can create a lot of different looks for this character. And I think all in all, that makes a tremendous difference to the kind of poses you can put her in and making her have that more dynamic feel in your collection when she's on display. And because of that, combined with the fact that this is the first time we're getting the classic version of this costume on this character, she's probably the standout figure in this set. She's probably the best of all the figures in this set. And probably the main driver for you picking this set up, I suspect, if you are a West Coast Avengers fan. So really cool to have this figure. I'm really happy to give this figure 4 stars, despite the fact that she's got the standard pin swivel at the elbow, and I much prefer having the double joint there. I still think this looks really striking and works really well, particularly with these accessories, and I'm pleased that they thought through that head sculpt to allow the maximum posability there as well without compromising the look too much. So all in all, very successful. And then finally in this set we have Tigra. Now once again this is a figure that has been released previously, actually not too long ago, and is essentially a re-release but with a couple of important tweaks which make all the difference in my opinion. First up though, we have to acknowledge that there was actually another release previously as part of the Nemesis wave going back a very, very long time ago. This figure was very difficult to get hold of. I really wanted it at the time. I never managed to snag one. It looked pretty cool at the time. With hindsight and obviously with things moving on, it probably is the weaker version. Because just a couple of years ago we did get this updated version which was released on this special retro card, and at the time a lot of people pushed back against this. They weren't really happy with this figure. Me personally, I thought it was absolutely fine. I was just delighted to have the character in the collection at last. But this figure that we have today is a simple re-release of that figure. But as I said, there are a couple of noticeable differences. And the key one here is the head sculpt. I think this is a massively, much improved head sculpt on the straight-haired version. This feels a little bit more wild, but it's still a more serene look in the face. And I think they've done a really good job of it. Now, my criticism of the hair is that it's lacking any paint apps here to really bring that texture to life and give it a bit more depth, which is really disappointing. But other than that, I think this is a really vastly superior and much improved head sculpt, and I think this works tremendously well. The other key consideration, of course, is the fact that this actually has a different paint scheme when it comes to the plastic that's been moulded in. So this is a much more toned down orange. It's less vivid and less bright. It's a much more even, sort of gentler, brighter orange, and it works tremendously well. I really, really like this. And overall, I have to say, I really like the paint apps on this figure. We see each individual stripe painted on, the bone sort of skirt bit to the top of the bikini line. I don't know what to call it, I'm sorry. But that is actually sculpted in, which is really cool. And I think the attention to detail here is really good. And it's actually all perfectly painted in the way it should be. There's no smudging or blending anywhere. And I think this looks really, really good. I also really like the tail and how that's been applied. Again, the paint app's very neat here, and I just think it looks really quite cool. There's nothing else really to talk about. Of course, the feet are slightly different to your standard Marvel Legends female figure because it does actually have the toes. And all in all, this is a very nicely presented figure. I'm really, really happy with it. Again, I'm just going to cover the key points when it comes to the articulation. Looking at the ball joint there at the top of the head, she can move from side to side. It is a little bit restricted on that right-hand side because of the hairpiece that comes forward, but she can move it comfortably from side to side and wobble it left and right, and she kind of can bend it forwards and backwards, but not a huge amount. The other key difference with this figure, of course, is that, like the Spider-Woman, she has the double joints at the elbow, which is absolutely fantastic and really pleasing to see, which is excellent stuff. And then the other really outstanding point is the fact that she has the tail as well, which will rotate from side to side. This doesn't really exist on a ball joint, unfortunately, so you can't really bend it out and in. If you do, it will just pop out. Accessories wise, she doesn't do too badly considering she's a character that doesn't really have anything in the way of accessories. So she has an alternate pair of open hands and she has an alternate feral head. I think this works really well. I can't really think of anything else I would want the character to come with. This head and these hands, of course, were released previously with the previous release, and there's nothing really been changed here. Once again, for me, this is another 4-star figure. I'm really, really happy with it. I'm happy with the articulation, I'm happy with the sculpting, I'm happy with the paint apps, and what little accessories she does come with, I'm also very pleased with. So I think they've covered the full package here and they've done a really good job. And I think for those who already picked up the first version of this figure just a couple of years ago, I think that improved serene head is definitely worth the double dip. And so, there you have it. I have to say, all in all, I'm really, really happy with this set. Now, I think there will be people out there, there will be detractors who rightly point out that there's a little corner cutting here. We're seeing some figures being re-released in their entirety, such as Tigra and Iron Man, with a couple of minor tweaks to paint apps and maybe alterations to head sculpts. But I do think that they actually do warrant the double dip because these are the superior versions. There's no two ways about it, in my personal opinion, that these are the best versions of those figures. This is an improved Silver Centurion Iron Man, in my opinion. Likewise, the Tigra with the calm head, way better than the previous release. I think the Spider-Woman is much improved as well, and I'm really pleased to have Mockingbird finally in her classic outfit, and an interesting version of Hank Pym that I never thought I'd ever own, to be honest. So I think all in all, this is a really cool set, and if you managed to pick up the Hawkeye last year as part of the Avengers 60th anniversary releases, then you have a pretty full set of figures here. You could even throw in the US agent, and it's starting to build out that roster across various different areas of the comic book, and I think that's pretty cool. Likewise, I was really happy with the packaging as well as a display piece, so all in all, I have to say this is probably one of the strongest Amazon exclusive sets we've had in a very long time. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.